Hi, guys. Welcome to the HGR Digital Asset Group podcast series, where we speak with thought leaders in the cryptocurrency space. Today, we have Professor Tonya Evans with us, and she's a professor at University of New Hampshire. How are you today, Professor?
I'm excellent. How are you today?
I'm pretty good as well. Thank you so much for getting on the call with me. I'm very excited to learn more about your expertise, especially since we don't have a lot of legal practitioners and lawyers on our show that often. So the first question that I'd like to ask is, can you just give us a brief background on your academic training, your professional experience, and your your background in general?
Sure. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I was or am a lifelong athlete. So I played or competed in numerous sports, but settled in on tennis and was awarded a full scholarship to attend Northwestern University. Uh, After graduation from Northwestern, I played on the professional women's circuit for 4 years, played tennis on the circuit. So I have a
Oh, wow.
very non-traditional path to where I am now, although I think all of those experiences really informed who I am today because I believe in this diverse process of coming into who you actually are, and all of those experiences are great. So I played tennis. Um, I left the tennis court and went for the court of law, as they say, and I attended Howard University School of Law on an academic scholarship. I was the editor-in-chief of the Law Journal, graduated with honors, and clerked in the Third Circuit for a year, and worked at a couple of international law firms, actually in the trust and estates department of um, both firms. My mother is also a patent attorney, so when I left big firm life, I joined her, and we were in practice for some time before she retired to move on to some nonprofit work. And then I continued on my own until I started teaching as an adjunct at a small college in Pennsylvania. But I love education. I'm a lifelong learner, and did enjoy my experience in law school. I don't know if anybody else would agree with me, but I thought law school was a fantastic place to be. And so I'm thrilled to be teaching law at UNH Law, and I'm a member of the Franklin Pierce Center for Intellectual Property faculty.
That's fantastic. I really like Northwestern. I've actually visited Northwestern once because my sister goes to the Medill School of Journalism over there. It's quite cold
Yes,
though, but I guess that you get like a white Christmas, right? So there are different
absolutely.
trade-offs there. I really like your background as well as an athlete. I have a tremendous respect for athletes because of your discipline, your dedication, and how you're able to practice tirelessly to perfect your craft. And as you mentioned, now you're taking these skill sets and applying it to the new court of law, and I like that. So
Yes.
the next question that I'd like to talk about is how did you fall down the rabbit hole of blockchain and crypto? And just for our listeners, when I say rabbit hole, that does not mean that it's a bad thing. It's like the term disruption, but I think it requires some clarification. So one example is, I have a lot of Chinese clients, and when I tell my Chinese clients about the word disruption, they think
Mm.
disruption is something that is super negative, even though it's used in the context of technology. So, but rabbit hole, I mean, how did you get introduced to the crypto space, and why are you so excited by the space and not necessarily willing to, I guess, go back to traditional? Well, I mean, I guess you do traditional law, but just like focusing on the addicting aspect of this industry.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for the explanation too. I think we all have to remember that use these terms of art, and they really can get lost in translation. And the one of the most exciting things about blockchain for me is that it is borderless. At least has the potential to be in its purest form, and it transcends all borders. And when we think of silos, you can certainly think of a siloed experience within a particular border of a country. So blockchain and distributed ledger technology transcends that. So I love it. And that leads me to the answer to your question. A very good friend who I'd heard about Bitcoin before even understanding the underlying technology of blockchain. Um, a dear friend was working on some research about blockchain and about AI, artificial intelligence, and all those things are very interesting to me as an intellectual property lawyer generally, but a copyright lawyer and professor specifically, because I write in the area of copyright mostly and new technologies and the impact of new technology on those disciplines. And so as I continued to listen, I was starting to think of the use cases that you might have beyond currency. But in order to really appreciate what that meant, I wanted to put a little skin in the game, understand the movement of cryptocurrency. I focused on, the big two um, for now, Bitcoin and Ethereum. I wanted to buy a little. I realized that because of, the 18 decimals and the fractional interest in Bitcoin and also for Ether and some of the other altcoins as well, that, I could put a tiny bit in. Um, uh, if I made a mistake, it wouldn't be the end of the world. And once I started the process of, setting up an account, doing KYC, moving from, Coinbase to Binance, and the thrill of being able to do that and have all of these transactions with people I don't know where they are, but I was really moving value, and that is unbelievably exciting to me. And from that, I really did take a deep dive. I remember being on holiday at the end of the first semester, and basically all of December was used for me listening to every podcast I could get my ears on, and every article and blog, and I would talk about it, and many people didn't know what I was talking about. So then I started going to conferences so that I could find people to connect with, and develop the next level because I'm an educator was trying to figure out based upon this. I feel like everybody needs to know. I love the technology. I feel very, very strong. I'm very bullish on cryptocurrency, but it's more than cryptocurrency for me because I'm thrilled with the technology and the potential that it has to disrupt, as you said earlier, so many different avenues and so many different industries, not the least of which is the practice of law. So that was my journey, and it was a quick one and a wonderful one because it led me back to what could I do as an educator to continue to write, speak, and teach on new technologies and to empower my students and others to work in this space as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I also agree with how the borderless functions of these technologies can be very useful. I think one primary use case would be for cross-border transactions, and we forget that today the systems that we have that we use over the internet, I think a lot of these systems, so ACH and your Swift network, those were invented prior to the widespread adoption of the internet. And
Hmm.
as Tyler and Cameron Winklevoss like to say, it's like fitting a square peg in a round hole. So it it works. Online payments work, and yeah, sure, PayPal is a $1 billion company, but still, it's very limited in its efficiency. The next point is, as an educator, you mentioned that you're very excited about learning the most up-to-date technologies and passing on this knowledge to your enthusiastic students. So, I think good leaders give back, and you're obviously a good leader. And it's arguable that the greatest leaders are professors such as yourself because you're pretty much your whole life, like 24/7, you're dedicated to the advancement of knowledge. I obviously don't have as much experience as you do in teaching, but I'm a TA, a teaching assistant for
Hmm.
several classes at Emory, business communications and entrepreneurial private equity. And one thing that I'm very interested in is seeing how professors structure their courses to help disseminate information to students in the most effective but also practical way. So you told me offline that that you were coming up with a very innovative new blockchain course for your students. Can you tell us more about how you're structuring this course and I guess, the main takeaways that you'd like your students to come out of the class with?
Sure. It's interesting because I am a law professor, but what we're doing at the law school is also kind of building the bridge between our undergraduate campus and the law school. And so we've developed an entire cognate, really, of some core classes of, fill in the blank and the law to introduce undergrads at an earlier time in their career to the possibilities of the legal implications of many of the, well, really every facet of society and the other things that they're studying. We set up education in an odd way in some respects because we wait, for the Juris Doctor experience for law training. Where everybody doesn't have to go to law school in order to appreciate the discipline and the legal implications of the areas of study and what they will ultimately go on to do. So I was really excited about the opportunity to develop a course specifically for undergrads, and so that's where I'm going to start blockchain and the law. I do have a higher level course that will be offering both in person and online in the future. I encourage your listeners to connect with me on Twitter at IPProf, PROF Evans, on Twitter for some exciting announcements coming up in the months to come. But for now, this is an undergrad course, live, it's synchronous, and I like for students to get in. I throw them kind of in the middle of the ocean with some questions and no foreseeable answers, but I leave a lot of uh, um, pointers along the way. I like to often flip the classroom and have them read a certain amount of information to come into class ready for discussions, for experimentation. I'm focused on the non-technical, or what I call the tech adjacent side of that. So although I will likely have experts either Zoom in or come into class and talk about some technical things, I often tell students who are interested but not interested in the technical aspect, you don't have to understand the technical aspect to understand the potential disruptive impacts of this type of technology because we're living in an age where I can imagine it was like the advent of the internet when people were trying to figure out what this thing was and how on earth you could standardize it so that the entire um, global system could agree to a certain standard or a certain HTTP protocol, for example. So you don't have to understand the intricacies of the ones and the zeros in order to understand what its intended purpose was with the original Bitcoin blockchain, what subsequent use cases in terms of smart contracts and decentralized autonomous organizations, all those other things, and how it will impact different areas. And so I like to set up almost a sandbox of sorts, but in a non-technical way, so that they will learn everything from the overall legal landscape. So that includes government, that includes payment systems, certainly intellectual property, which is my background, the regulatory landscape, civil and criminal liability issues. But what I'd love to do is to almost have a hackathon where we're not tinkering with code per se, but really tinkering with a potential problem that they are focused on and how it might or might not be resolved through blockchain or distributed ledger technology. And that way it makes it also fun for students. They get to hear from experts in the field where it may not be my background, but it's important for their education. And then they get to knock around some ideas, and by the end, one, they certainly have an understanding of the impact and the implications of the technology, but they may have an interest in healthcare or energy, supply chain, something else, and they can use that bit of knowledge to, make themselves even more marketable when they hit the job market. So that's really my goal.
That sounds like a super fun class. I think I totally agree with your point on the distinction between understanding how something works and maybe a more deeper level understanding of the technical code. And the way I like to think about it is you can think of it as a mathematical equation, right? So just because you don't know how to derive an equation doesn't mean that you don't know how to use it. And sometimes using the formula can be more powerful than knowing or understanding how to derive it. So my thoughts exactly. And now that we're talking about the potential use cases, you mentioned healthcare was one of them. And I'd like to focus on your expertise, which is the IP issues or intellectual property issues in blockchain. So a few thoughts that I have are, I guess the first decentralized apps were like the Pirate Bay decentralized file sharing. And I'm just curious, like, do you think that IP issues can be resolved through this technology? And are there sufficient incentives to derail bad actors? And what I'm thinking is that there are whole businesses in less economically developed countries, such as the Philippines and in China, where people just sell a bunch of cheap fake shows,
Hmm.
movies, and today there's so much content. Do producers and artists who are budding and who don't necessarily have a name yet, can they be very demanding when it comes to copyright enforcement? And in many cases, I can see how a burgeoning new artist may actually think piracy can be a double-edged sword and that it can potentially be a viral marketing strategy. So what are your
Hmm.
thoughts on the IP issues?
This is such an important question, and there's a lot to unpack there. I think the short answer, you originally mentioned incentives, and that's a really important word when you're talking about intellectual property in general and copyright in particular, on the patent side as well, and trademark, because the law creates these exclusive rights for a certain period of time. And the theory being, or the thought being, at least from the United States' perspective, that there needs to be some economic incentive, not necessarily to create, but certainly to share those creations with the public, right? So it's a quid pro quo, certain period of time. In the case of copyright, there's the exclusive right to copy, to prepare derivative works or adaptations, to publicly perform, publicly display, and to distribute, right? Those are the core exclusive rights for copyright. And the ability to license that out. And so that's how we get, music licensing or licensing of a film, for example. And in exchange for that ability, they get to derive that economic value over a sufficient period of time when the value is often difficult to ascertain at the outset of intellectual property. We don't know what the demand is going to be. We don't know what the impact is. There are other countries, though, that don't focus exclusively on this idea of an economic incentive. That's why it makes it interesting when you ask about use cases in the intellectual property space, and there are a number of them I'm really excited about because, with the core attributes of blockchain technology, it can be used to prove ownership or priority of rights. So, for example, priority is important in the patent case. In some instances, first to file. In other countries, maybe first to invent. From a trademark perspective, the first to use has priority of rights with respect to common law trademark rights, or first to register affords the registrant certain additional protections beyond common law protections. Um, and so, in that respect, blockchain is fantastic. Proof of ownership, priority, the ability to register works. I'm using the term register in quotation marks right now because there are use cases that are developing registries of copyrighted works that is a different system than the official Copyright Office system. So that's unless and until the Copyright Office adopts its own blockchain, and I hope someday that they will, these other registries, we'll call them, serve at least to have some additional public information about a date certain that a creative work existed and who the person is. And creating this type of digital footprint or digital ID, not only for the creator and or owner or the one who controls the work, but the work itself, right? So an Ethereum network has the ability, when we're building on top of it, you can have all sorts of smart contracts in terms of micropayments. You can track use in that way. So the owner's management of content and the content owner or licensor is clearly um, a solvable issue with blockchain technology for all of the three big areas of intellectual property law. I just want to say one more thing about that with respect to copyright and some of the interesting use cases that are serving as registries. There's one, I don't have any affiliation to any of the ones that I'm mentioning, but I am excited about some in particular. There's one known as Dot Blockchain Media. It was created by a gentleman named, I believe, Benji Rogers, out of Berklee College of Music. And he's working with other people, certainly. But the idea is to create an extension that every content owner or creator in the music industry would use. Literally, the extension .bc to stand for blockchain. Yeah, and the way I understand it is essentially a consortium of those intermediaries that we are trying to remove from the system as we remove friction and the need for trust, right? That's some of the essential features of blockchain. And if the industry could agree to an extension, so instead of MP3s and MP4s and other things, this .bc, and agree to a certain, what we refer to as minimum viable data, like that baseline information that we need to understand from the beginning who created a work, who currently controls the licensing of the work, then that can serve a solve for a host of problems when it's difficult to license or identify. And they're making some great progress there. And so you should definitely keep that on your radar of one of the most exciting use cases on the copyright side. There's some others, Ujo Music, PhotoChain, Jack Library, CopyTrack is another one. It's very interesting. So a lot of really smart people are working to solve for some of the issues presented by the questions you raised.
Yeah, I think that definitely a lot of potential use cases, and everyone is trying to find a solution using this technology. Sometimes it'll work out, and sometimes it might not work as effectively. Just a quick follow-up question is, in business school and in law school, like I'm getting conflicting views on whether or not like IP and patents are like where do they have the most value. So a lot of times, like if you go to an maybe like an M&A class, they'll say
Mm-hmm.
patents are only for defensive purposes, and companies like incumbents will acquire patents to fend off competition, not necessarily because the patent is good, but because they just don't want any potential trouble. And
Mm-hmm.
other folks, like I've spoken to one of the most prominent technologists in the Philippines, and he worked with Intel and HP like in the 1970s, I believe, and now he's like worth over $3 billion. So, where do you think that IP and patents are usually used for defensive purposes, or are they used for revenue generating purposes?
So the right that is granted through patent is the right to exclude. So it doesn't require that somebody uses, they just have the ability for a certain period of time, I think it's 20 years, to exclude others. And so the value of that is if you have the right to prevent others from innovating in a particular space without, the ability to license from the patentee, then that is a valuable right, and that's where the value is derived. But that doesn't require them to actually use it. And so I think to your point, this idea of blocking patents is an interesting question. It also just happens, as you know, from a business perspective. A business is threatened by the existence of some upstart, and they'll buy them out and won't do another thing with it, right? So the
Yeah.
same idea you see in the patent context when someone may innovate in an area and then not actually use it, but they have the right to at least exclude so that whatever other perhaps patents or other trade secrets that they may have, they can extend the value in other areas by not utilizing or using the patent that they're using to block other innovation. So I think it's not either or, but both and. There is some value, but it may not be in exercising or using, exploiting, I should say, that patent but in not doing so, because it increases the value of other assets they may hold.
Yeah. So when technology changes, a lot of professions can change as well. So I think when you look at a lot of the old movies with a lot of lawyers, like you'll see them have, let's say, like 10 books open at once. And I think now technology has made law a lot easier with certain different aspects like shepherdizing, or finding whether or not past cases are still relevant. Will smart contracts replace lawyers, or what is a lawyer's role in relationship to smart contract coding? And what do you think Ethereum's impact will be on legal agreements and contract law?
So whenever I hear, um, you know, smart contracts, so when you say that to a lawyer, we think of something entirely different because we are focused on the legal definition of contract. All contracts are agreements, but not all agreements are contracts as a matter of law. And so I think that's why when lawyers start to talk, everybody else hears wah, 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 because we're
Yeah,
focused on a pretty specific definition of it. But me, because of my technology interest and background, I love the potential impact, and not only potential, the actual impact. I mean, we are experiencing it of smart contracts. But I often hear at conferences that code is law, and the only caveat that I would say is code isn't law. Code is code. Code is amazing. Code is great for the if-then sequence. If-then, if you can make something objective and then automate that, then there are many intermediaries that will necessarily fall by the wayside. And some of that, involves legal work that lawyers are doing now that they don't have to do. If, it comes down to enforcement, ensuring payments, audits, and things of that nature, that's a lot of money for attorney time that could be used doing other things. So lawyers will never be, I know that was, Nick Szabo's diabolical plan to get rid of all the lawyers. That
yeah,
reminds me of some Shakespeare reference as well. And even though I have a dog in the fight there, I eagerly invite smart contracting to be a necessary component of the more effective use of the law to service clients. I'm a problem solver. I'm not a pencil pusher, right? There are better uses of my
yep.
time at hundreds of dollars an hour than to do some of the things that could be automated. And I think that smart contracts are a really amazing way to solve for some of those things. The question of, you know, smart contracting and the role that it plays, though, is that you some things cannot be automated. Some parts of a contract are not if then. Sometimes it's just it depends. It I can think of your client will use his or her best efforts to, right? I can't really quantify that objectively. That is a facts and circumstances determination. And also, just because we're relying on code to automate certain functions doesn't mean that it uh, uh, does away with the legal requirements in a particular jurisdiction. And in the United States, that's on a state-by-state basis. Interesting issues that come up with smart contracting is if you have person A and person B and they don't, agree at the outset of how something's going to work, I don't know who that person is. I don't know who to follow up with if something doesn't go as planned. I don't know who to contact if there's some unforeseen thing that we didn't code for that now needs to be resolved. Am I going to fork off my own smart contract? Right? So there's some interesting things to work through. And that's why I joined the Accord Project's IP working group. I'm focused specifically on how to code some of the standard IP contracts we use. We've been focusing a lot on various licensing agreements and how to, code for specific if-then transactions. Like if my client sells 10,000 copies of this CD, then we have a royalty escalation to the next level, and they are automatically paid. Those are things that are obviously capable of being automated. And then some of the other things, the lawyering is going to happen, finally, in answer to your question, on the front end, where if you do have two parties coming together who know each other, then the lawyering happens on the front end when you're coming to an agreement of what the terms should be, and then using the smart contracts to automate the process of execution and authentication and verification.
Yeah, I think lawyers have a very important role to play in the development of this ecosystem. I think at the early stages, a lot of people would think that this space wasn't necessarily for lawyers, right? Because it was for like what is that called? Like cypherpunks and people
Yes.
who wanted to avoid the law. But now you see that when you go to a blockchain conference or even a local meetup, you'll see that there are actually lawyers there and they have very interesting things to say. And your point on automation reminds me of this a similar problem that we see working in the financial services industry. So working before in the Bay Area with a lot of technology companies doing their valuations, I felt that there were so many process inefficiencies that I guess we weren't using the best use of our time, and there's so many processes that can definitely be computerized.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I agree 100%. And the last question that I have for you today is that when technology evolves, I think it's important to make sure that the development of these technologies is very collaborative, right? And when we think about collaboration, I think one of your focuses is on ensuring that marginalized communities do have a seat at the table as these technologies emerge. So, how do you feel people from these communities should start acting, and what are ways to involve them so that the optimal decision and the optimal outcomes can be achieved?
Right. Great question. Yeah, it's a passion project of mine. I'm a woman of color. I'm a Black woman, and it's important that communities that are traditionally disenfranchised, particularly from the economic sphere, economic empowerment is very important. And, the original promise and purpose of Bitcoin was to remove centralized authorities, to allow us to transact one-on-one. This idea of borderless payments was important. And then I started to think of countries that don't have a sound government to even rely on. I think of places like Venezuela. Think of certain third world nations, countries in Africa, some parts of the Caribbean, where even if the law technically supports women in property ownership, and that is not guaranteed around the world, that there are cultural norms that continue to disenfranchise women in terms of property ownership and managing their own finances. So how powerful and empowering it is to, have the ability to transfer value from a phone or other areas. That necessitates that we have net neutrality. That necessitates that people have access to technology at affordable rates, and affordable means different things to different people in different countries and even within a country. And so being able to empower women first at this level with education about the technology and the power of it, and we need to go to places where people are to introduce that early and often. So I'm looking for various opportunities to do that. Certainly am in the process of developing my own um, um, series of webinars and ways to inform women and people of color, and also young people. So I'm in the process of finding different organizations, like Black Girls Code is a fantastic one that introduces young girls to technology and coding. They're making their own blockchains. They don't need me for that, but I talk about the non-technical pieces and intellectual property pieces and offer that to various groups as well. So we're also on the side of just participating, as you said, in the ecosystem, that there's been much discussion of these manos instead of panels, all male panels. And there are
Yeah.
hundreds of women at unbelievable levels in this space. We have two women in the financial sector who are now running, I think, the Nice and one other exchange. We are at every level in business, and we should be reflected on those panels. I just finally participated in Women on the Block in New York. It's a fantastic conference, over 30 plus women in various areas of the ecosystem. And so it's being intentional about that, because even though we're almost 10 years out from the Bitcoin blockchain, this is still at its infancy. We have a great opportunity to inform this technology for the future, to reflect more broadly the greater global system, not just our little ecosystem, but the global ecosystem and the value of exchange. And so I look forward to participating in that, and I love what you're doing to educate others in that regard as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love what you're doing, and I think it's very important to when you have different minds that come together from different socio-economic, political, and maybe even religious backgrounds, it really
Mm-hmm.
helps people and groups make more informed, more comprehensive, and better decisions. And there's been a lot of studies that show that. To end, like at the beginning, you mentioned that your mom was a patent lawyer, and I think what we come to realize is that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, and I think your mom
Yes,
would be very proud of all the initiatives that you're spearheading today. So, yeah, thank you so much again, Professor Evans. And yeah, I guess if you're ever in Atlanta, or if I ever find myself in New Hampshire, I'd love to meet in person and yeah, talk more about these technologies.
I would love that. I don't know if you'll be there at the time, but I'm speaking at a blockchain conference on May 31st in Atlanta. So if you are there, I would love to meet you.
Oh wow, yeah, I'll actually still be in the Philippines actually, but I'll let my friends who are based in Atlanta know about your event. I think it'll be a good one. Atlanta, at least, I think Atlanta is one of the biggest technology hubs in
Hmm.
the southern part of the U.S. So hopefully there'll be more more enthusiasm from the the folks that hang out over there.
Excellent, excellent. And your listeners can find me online at proftanyaevans.com. And I look forward to continuing our dialogue virtually and in the future in person. Thank you for having me.
Got it. Thank you so much, and I'll be sure to include your Twitter as well.